Hi, this is Christian McLean. This is the second video in our evolution section, and in this particular episode, we're going to talk a little bit about the details of Darwin's concept on natural selection. So, as we finished the last section, we had discussed how Darwin organized his ideas and published it in 1859 when he was talking about um, the origin of species by means of natural selection. And one of the things that's kind of interesting is throughout the book, Darwin doesn't use the term evolution. However, at the very end of the book, one of the final statements, he used the word evolved. Um, Darwin stuck to the concept of descent with modification to try to explain how some of the diversity and the unity within life existed. So we're going to talk a little bit about the concept of descent with modification, as well as the idea of natural selection as a way to cause adaptive evolution. Okay, so let's click down here. All right, so, and here's that statement I was just talking about, the fact that he didn't use evolution, but rather stuck with descent with modification. So when we take a look at Darwin's personal notes, this is an image that was recorded out of some of his notebooks there. Darwin definitely used what's called tree thinking, and he believed that there were different branches that came off of a main trunk. And Darwin held a strong belief that the organisms that we have today were descendants of one another, that they had common ancestry. And if we take a look at this particular graphic here, which is taken out of our books, and this particular image is on page 468, um, and if you take a look at it, one of the things that it's going to show us is that when we have different species, okay, so as we compare the three elephants that are at the bottom of this particular chart, one of the things that we're going to see is that they are definitely different species. And we'll talk later about the actual definition of what a species is and the ability to have offspring with one another that are going to be fertile offspring, being at the heart of the biological definition. But we have three distinct species of elephant that are right here. And the way this is depicted, it makes up what's called a cladogram. And we're going to talk about cladograms in a later section of the evolution material. And the College Board always emphasizes being able to read and interpret cladograms. But what this is showing is points where they had a common ancestor. Okay, so like if we were to go back each of these lines, we can see that that's kind of a lineage of how these organisms were related. And they represent a point where there was a what they call a derived character, something that's different, something that's a feature of sorts that separates them. So when we look at these three, we're going to notice that there are these individuals all through here are extinct. Okay, and can't really see it on this particular graphic, but in the book, they're all marked with an asterisk that means that they are no longer with us. They are extinct. And they estimate that 99% of all the things that ever lived at one point on the earth have gone extinct. Um, so our most recent common relative would be the manatee and the hyraxes. So if we take a look right here, they branch. This would be the point where they had a common ancestor. There would be some feature. I'm not sure exactly what that feature is just from looking at this graphic, but we're going to spend a lot of time with cladograms on a later particular unit. Okay, and here's just a zoomed in image of that particular portion, and you can see that the idea is that the Asian elephant and the two variations of the African elephant, um, they were fairly closely related and they had common ancestors. And then, of course, the individuals that fell into these other branches are no longer with us. Okay, so one of the things that Darwin did to help get his concepts across to people is he took a look at some things that people really understood. And from like an agricultural standpoint or from an animal breeding standpoint, um, people understood that we could kind of intensify certain characteristics and traits that we find desirable. So somebody that was in agricultural breeding, end of things, they could intensify certain features that would be maybe useful or helpful. So we call that artificial selection. And Darwin believed through his observations and his research that there was a natural selection that was taking place, which meant that it wasn't other humans that were picking and choosing, but rather the environment was creating scenarios that were either going to be favorable or not favorable for different organisms. And he believed that not all organisms have equal opportunity to be successful. Okay, so Darwin described 4 observations, and from that he drew some inferences. And a couple of these observations, as we look at them now, they're pretty obvious. So we'll start with the first one. It says members of a population often vary greatly in their traits. Just make sure you understand a population is members of the same species. Okay, so when you have a group of members of the same species living in a similar area at a particular point in time, they make up a population. So you're going to have differences. Um, Observation number 2, we study genetics pretty heavily. I think we understand that our traits, and when we think about our traits, we're thinking a lot of times about our phenotypes. And yes, there are environmental components to that, but the majority of how we see our phenotype is based on what our genetic underlying characteristics are, and that comes from our parents. So traits are inherited from parents and spread to the offspring. Observation number 3, all species are capable of producing more offspring than the environment can support. We're going to see somebody who really influenced Darwin on that particular concept, but basically he understood that point 3 and point 4, and point 4 says due to a lack of food and other resources, many of the offspring do not survive. Putting these two concepts together, Darwin understood and believed that there was a constant, I don't want to say battle, but there was a constant stress to meet the requirements necessary for life. And sometimes that resulted in individuals not being able to meet their basic needs. And once they didn't do that, they were no longer able to survive. If they don't survive, clearly they can't reproduce. Their traits don't go to the next generation. So that's the underlying concept of how these things work out. So let's look at his inferences that he was able to draw based on his observations. Inference number 1, individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a given environment tend to leave more offspring than other individuals. So this is a measure of your fitness, how well you're going to be able to pass your genes on to the next generation. So if you have a better chance of surviving, you're obviously going to have a better chance of seeing your traits show up in the next generation. Okay. Clearly, if you don't match your environment, then your chance of surviving is going to be diminished, and your chance of passing those alleles onto other generations is going to also be reduced. And inference number 2 is just basically telling us that it's not equal, it's not balanced, it's not guaranteed. It says an unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce leads to an accumulation of favorable traits in the population over generations. So basically, if we take a look at it, individuals who are not going to be successful are going to, in many ways, no longer be in that population. They're gonna face stresses. They're not gonna be able to meet their basic needs. So if they don't survive, they don't reproduce. Their alleles don't pass on to the next generation. So those are 2 inferences that really shape the idea. Now, we had talked earlier in an earlier video that there were a lot of people, and that's true for pretty much all discoveries and concepts, that people are going to assemble different concepts and ideas. One individual's readings that definitely influenced Darwin's idea was from Thomas Malthus, and he was talking mostly from an economic standpoint, taking a look at the potential for human populations to increase faster than food supplies and other resources. But Darwin took it to the next level. He said, you know what? It's not just humans, it's not just money or resources or food, but it's everything, whether we're talking about access to food, access to mates, access to habitat. Um, so it led to this understanding that there's kind of this ongoing competition that exists. So make sure you know that Thomas Malthus was definitely influential for Darwin. Um, it says if some heritable traits are advantageous, they accumulate in a population and they increase the frequency of individuals with adaptations. So basically, if you have something that gives you an advantage, that trait will most likely show up in the next generation because you're going to have success and you're going to be able to pass that trait to another generation. Okay, so just to kind of wrap this up, the summary of natural selection. Point number one, it says individuals with certain heritable characteristics survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals. Okay, just remember that that is not a balance, it's not a guarantee. Individuals um, that are going to survive are going to have features and characteristics that are going to be a great match for their environment. Okay. And that helps to kind of determine which individuals and which traits are going to show up in the next generation. Number two, natural selection increases the adaptation of organisms to their environment over time. So we're going to see in a later video, in a later section of the reading, that sometimes the environment does shift rapidly. And we're going to see that that can throw things out of balance. It can create a major shift as far as what's favored and not favored. But if the environment is progressing at a slow rate, as it typically does, you're going to end up with organisms that are going to be better matched for their environment. So over time, organisms that don't fit the environment are going to diminish. And our third point is, as the environment changes over time, natural selection may result in adaptation to new conditions that give rise to new species. So we'll talk a lot about the process of speciation as well as extinction. So organisms that are here today, as we talked about before, our fossil record indicates that there's been a lot of change over time in terms of the species that we have. Maybe 99% of them are different than what we've had at different points in Earth history. So, the species that are here are going to be reflective of what's going to match the current environment. There's a video clip here. It talks a lot about finch evolution. It's found inside your Google Slides for this particular chapter. I'd spend a few minutes and watch it. It just talks about the finches. I'll have some other videos that are posted as well, so we can kind of go through there. And then the final point as we wrap this section up, we want to make sure that we understand that individuals themselves don't evolve. Okay, it's a population. So when you're looking at it from the species level, individuals in that overall population of a certain species may have traits that are better matched, but they themselves don't evolve. They pass on traits so that the next generation has traits that match the environment and so forth and so on. And we would say that if we see an overall shift in the population to match the environment, then that's a population that has evolved. But individuals themselves don't evolve. Number two, natural selection can only increase or decrease heritable traits in a particular population. So, you're not only are we looking at heritable traits, but traits that are actually different. And, it's going to have to be a genetic basis to that. So that's why this really falls in line with the sequence of material that we've covered. And the last point is adaptations vary with different environments. So what's favorable in one environment may not be favorable in all environments. So you start to get differential success at different points throughout the planet. Okay, hope that helps, and we'll see you on another video in the next section.